Situated 45 miles offshore, this maritime installation represents an extreme paradigm of geographic isolation and sustained exposure to hostile environmental variables. Commissioned in 1882, the outpost serves as a critical navigational anchor while simultaneously functioning as a vital node for meteorological data collection. Logistics for extraction and insertion dictate a high-risk maritime transit across unpredictable waters, rendering standard supply chains completely unviable. Approaching the perimeter requires navigating volatile swells that physically assault the foundation, severely limiting the operational windows for any vessel docking. The structure completely lacks integration with modern power grids or standard telecommunication networks, forcing reliance on localized, fail-prone survival systems. Ingress demands scaling a 20-foot oxidized exterior ladder, exposing personnel to immediate kinetic hazards from shear drops and freezing spray. Securing equipment requires localized rigging systems. The sheer physical exertion required to hoist basic survival gear immediately degrades operational stamina. Historical data indicates that prolonged deployment in these specific operational parameters induces severe psychological friction and measurable cognitive decline in personnel. Maintaining an overnight presence within the facility initiates a mandatory 24-hour isolation protocol, permanently severing immediate abort options. Surface transportation assets must immediately withdraw post-insertion, transferring all survival responsibility entirely to the unassisted ground team within the structure. Internal microclimates exhibit persistent dampness and suppressed temperatures, permanently preventing the thermal recovery of exposed personnel and compromised equipment. Archival reports from former operators equate the psychological and physical confinement of the installation to maximum security penal incarceration. The reality of geographic detachment manifests immediately. Initial localized movements result in compromised thermal layers and critical loss of body heat. Ambient temperatures are projected to breach the freezing threshold, elevating the risk of localized frostbite and systemic hypothermic degradation in operatives. Emergency extraction requires a minimum 4-hour response cycle from mainland assets, nullifying any prospect of immediate medical or tactical intervention. Primary communication with the extraction asset remains severed until the designated rendezvous timeline activates the following morning at 1100 hours. Biological indicators surrounding the exterior perimeter, including localized avian mortality, point to severe environmental toxicity or concussive weather anomalies. Atmospheric pressure drops indicate the rapid approach of a severe meteorological event, drastically escalating the exterior threat matrix. The approaching storm cell introduces catastrophic kinetic and electrical hazards, directly targeting the singular elevated structure in the maritime sector. Static electrical buildup in the atmosphere physically manifests on personnel, signaling an imminent, high-probability lightning strike in the immediate vicinity. Operatives are forced into an immediate tactical retreat beneath the primary metal superstructure to mitigate the risk of direct atmospheric discharge. Securing the primary access point requires overriding outdated mechanical locking mechanisms that have suffered extensive degradation from sustained saltwater exposure. Unauthorized entry into this specific federally controlled maritime sector carries severe legal and punitive consequences under established jurisdictional parameters. Overcoming the mechanical failure of the primary lock is critical. Failure to breach the interior subjects the team to lethal exterior exposure. Successful breach of the primary threshold reveals an internal environment completely devoid of electrical illumination or active thermal regulation systems. The interior atmospheric temperature registers significantly lower than exterior readouts, functioning as a concrete thermal sink that aggressively drains body heat. Tactical blueprints outline a vertical defensive structure consisting of 7 primary compartmentalized zones and 2 subterranean levels slated for subsequent investigation. Initial upward progression through the facility reveals the extensive decay of previously operational power conduits and legacy infrastructure. Navigation through the confined, light-deprived corridors induces spatial disorientation, amplifying the psychological stress vectors inherent to the isolated environment. Restricted exterior visibility from reinforced observation ports limits situational awareness, forcing reliance on auditory analysis of the hostile maritime conditions. Analysis of the primary ascent vector reveals a steep, narrow spiral configuration, tactically designed to restrict rapid upward mobility. The intermediate levels previously housed designated personnel quarters, showcasing the historical hierarchy and functional separation within the operational unit. Interior surface degradation exposes layers of historical lead-based chemical coatings, introducing a latent secondary biohazard to the enclosed operational space. Historical records indicate these specific living quarters were operational during the late 19th century, equipped with primitive but essential thermal generation units. Upward progression intersects the legacy battery storage sector, a critical reminder of the structure's historical reliance on localized, stored energy reserves. Physical graffiti and temporal markers left by previous operators provide verifiable timestamps of human occupation dating back several decades. Investigation of localized mechanical subsystems reveals complete operational failure, confirming the total reliance on portable, team-supplied survival equipment. Forcing entry into restricted internal compartments reveals highly confined spaces that rapidly trigger claustrophobic responses in unconditioned personnel. Discovery of additional avian biological decay within the sealed compartments suggests unrecognized structural breaches and compromised internal air quality. Ascending toward the apex of the structure reveals an anomalous thermal increase, contradicting the established temperature gradients of the lower levels. Exterior observation from the uppermost platform during an active electrical storm represents a critical violation of established high-altitude survival protocols. The structural apex provides a comprehensive 360-degree tactical overview of the isolated geographic footprint and the surrounding volatile water mass. Telecommunication signals temporarily establish a weak connection, offering a fragile, momentary tether to mainland intelligence networks. The primary optical housing contains the modernized navigational beacon, essential for preventing catastrophic maritime collisions within the sector. Despite modernization efforts, the apex sector remains vulnerable to biological intrusion, indicating persistent failures in the exterior environmental sealing. The facility operates in a dual-use capacity, actively utilized by allied scientific factions for continuous atmospheric and climatological surveillance operations. Strategic ownership of the asset requires massive capital injection to neutralize structural decay and optimize the facility for next-generation intelligence gathering. Observation of severe surface turbulence and distinct wave patterns confirms escalating wind velocities, signaling a sustained degradation of exterior operational conditions. Thermal mapping confirms the uppermost optical chamber retains the highest ambient temperature, designating it as the primary objective for the overnight bivouac. Establishing a sleep rotation on the exterior platforms is immediately classified as a non-viable operational strategy due to lethal exposure risks. Forensic examination of the upper chamber walls using ultraviolet illumination reveals obscured anomalous markings, suggesting undocumented activities by previous personnel. Unverified operational lore references a fatal explosive event in the 1960s, a localized trauma that historically degraded the psychological readiness of subsequent deployments. Subterranean structural reconnaissance is strategically delayed until the onset of total darkness to prioritize exterior threat assessment during remaining daylight hours. Caloric intake is restricted to high-density, low-preparation field rations, specifically heavily processed carbohydrates, dried proteins, and synthetic combat-style consumables. The planned primary meal consists of field-expedient fajita components, prepared utilizing a portable, pressurized hydrocarbon combustion stove within the unventilated perimeter. Interior resting parameters are compromised by extensive biological contamination, specifically concentrated avian bio-waste covering all horizontal surfaces, eliminating standard seating options. The prolonged isolation parameters historically forced operators into extended cycles of sensory deprivation and psychological endurance testing, lasting several uninterrupted months. Establishing a contingency sleep sector on a lower deck provides a secondary tactical fallback position should the primary apex chamber become environmentally untenable. Deploying unmanned aerial surveillance assets initiates immediate risk due to volatile crosswinds, severely impacting flight stability and drone retrieval vectors. A sudden localized atmospheric pressure drop instantly increases wind shear, nearly forcing a critical loss of high-value optical recording equipment over the edge. The loss of critical thermal layering gear to the maritime environment immediately compromises an operator's ability to maintain core body temperature. Emergency retrieval of the compromised thermal jacket requires improvised rigging systems, utilizing weighted lines to snag the fabric before it saturates and sinks. The successful recovery of the primary thermal jacket prevents a critical degradation of the team's localized survival capability for the impending overnight cycle. Tactical deployment of localized fishing apparatus attempts to exploit local aquatic caloric resources, testing the viability of sustaining an extended unsupported presence. Analysis of the surrounding maritime sector indicates a complete absence of surface-level aquatic life, likely driven into deep water hibernation by plummeting thermal gradients. Retrieving the aquatic extraction line reveals localized biological scavenging, as the synthetic lure exhibits targeted damage consistent with unknown predatory action. The discovery of an intact avian specimen, far beyond standard biological flight ranges, suggests extreme atmospheric displacement caused by the advancing storm front. Nutritional sustainment includes highly experimental, commercially synthesized dairy rations engineered to replicate complex flavor profiles, specifically pizza derivatives. The ingestion of this chemically complex, freeze-dried ration induces immediate gastrointestinal distress and psychological aversion among the operating personnel. Structural constraints and interior biological hazards force the personnel to consume their primary caloric payload on the exposed, wind-battered exterior platform. Observation of localized avian fauna demonstrates extreme physiological adaptation, allowing the specimens to statically adhere to vertical masonry despite severe wind, shear. Operating 40 miles from the nearest mainland, support structure completely isolates the unit from any rapid response medical or logistical reinforcement protocols. The rapidly deteriorating atmospheric conditions signal a secondary meteorological convergence, threatening to saturate the exposed structure with freezing precipitation. The termination of the solar cycle provides a brief psychological reprieve, as the high-altitude vantage point offers a temporary distraction from the localized physical suffering. Personnel attempt to visually confirm a rare optical phenomenon at the exact moment of solar intersection with the horizon, testing localized atmospheric refraction limits. The failure to observe the projected green spectrum optical flash induces minor inter-squad friction, highlighting the escalating psychological tension of the confinement. The activation of the primary navigational beacon aggressively illuminates the interior chamber, introducing overwhelming, repetitive light pollution into the designated sleep sector. Combating the severe interior thermal drop requires the unsanctioned operation of the portable hydrocarbon stove, introducing critical carbon monoxide risks into the unventilated airspace. Sleep cycle projections are aggressively downgraded. Operatives anticipate a maximum of 3 hours of non-continuous, highly degraded rest due to environmental hostility. The localized survival footprint consists of specialized thermal isolation bags deployed directly adjacent to volatile chemical heating elements and remaining caloric reserves. Total loss of exterior solar illumination triggers the initiation of the subterranean reconnaissance protocol, forcing a tactical descent into the structural foundation. Approaching the lowest designated access point reveals severe atmospheric degradation, characterized by localized humidity spikes and the distinct olfactory signature of stagnant water. The subterranean infrastructure vastly exceeds official schematic projections, revealing an undocumented network of flooded, structurally compromised corridors beneath the primary foundation. Significant acoustic anomalies echo through the flooded substructure, indicating localized structural shifting or the movement of large, unidentified fluid masses. Breathing the confined atmosphere of the lower levels introduces unknown respiratory hazards due to century-old stagnation and persistent biological decay. Advancing through the subterranean sector requires precise foot placement to avoid total submersion in dark, chemically compromised standing water of unknown depth. The discovery of multi-directional branching tunnels completely contradicts the established architectural blueprints, inducing immediate spatial disorientation among the investigating team. Psychological resistance to the confined, flooded environment escalates rapidly, prompting several operatives to refuse further forward progression into the dark zone. Secondary ultraviolet sweeps within the subterranean sector reveal further anomalous, luminescent markings, mirroring the unauthorized data discovered in the upper apex chamber. Unidentified large-scale debris obstructs the primary flooded corridor, presenting a critical physical barrier to further reconnaissance and raising the immediate threat posture. The structural integrity of the flooded sublevels is critically compromised, with active fluid ingress threatening to permanently seal the lower access vectors. The primary investigation team executes an immediate tactical withdrawal from the subterranean network, classifying the sector as an unacceptable survival risk. Returning to the apex chamber confirms the exterior meteorological situation has severely degraded, with dense marine fog completely enveloping the optical housing. Now, The high-intensity navigational beam physically refracts off the dense particulate matter of the fog, creating an impenetrable wall of scattered white light. Condensation rapidly accumulates on the interior of the primary glass housing, physically dripping onto personnel and further degrading the localized thermal environment. The density of the external marine layer effectively blinds the structure, drastically increasing the probability of catastrophic kinetic intersection with heavy maritime traffic. Lunar observation through the particulate-heavy atmosphere reveals severe chromatic distortion, rendering the celestial body in deep, hostile shades of orange. The personnel initiate forced rest protocols within their thermal isolation bags, surrendering all exterior situational awareness to the blinding fog and crashing waves. The persistent rotational sweep of the high-intensity beacon prevents deep, rapid eye movement sleep, forcing operators into a state of continuous, exhausted twilight consciousness. The complete lack of external visual reference points during the nocturnal cycle severely distorts internal temporal perception, making the passage of time highly erratic. Termination of the nocturnal cycle reveals zero improvement in exterior visibility. Dense marine fog continues to entirely suppress the operational horizon. Physical recovery metrics indicate severe sleep deprivation, directly resulting from the sustained acoustic bombardment and thermal instability of the primary chamber. The extraction asset, designated Dave, is scheduled for a 1000 hours rendezvous, but current meteorological parameters render standard maritime navigation highly improbable. Complete suppression of visual reference points surrounding the installation induces acute psychological friction regarding the viability of the designated extraction timeline. Operators attempt to initiate fail-safe communication protocols, utilizing a specialized satellite uplink device designed for extreme geographic isolation. The portable satellite terminal requires unobstructed atmospheric alignment to establish a stable data tether with low Earth orbit communication arrays. Initial power cycling of the designated emergency communication hardware results in catastrophic system failure, indicating severe battery degradation or localized electromagnetic interference. Diagnostic checks confirm the satellite uplink is completely non-responsive, instantly severing the final technological lifeline to mainland logistical support. The total collapse of emergency communication infrastructure forces the unit into a passive survival posture, entirely dependent on the extraction asset's unconfirmed arrival. Initiation of the secondary daylight cycle requires immediate caloric replenishment to counter the sustained thermal drain of the persistent damp environment. Field rationing continues with the limited remaining inventory, forcing reliance on basic carbohydrates and heavily processed proteins to sustain an operational baseline. The psychological burden of indefinite confinement aggressively degrades unit cohesion, manifesting as heightened irritability and verbalized anxiety regarding extraction failure. Personnel are forced to execute basic biological functions, utilizing highly compromised, rudimentary sanitation protocols due to the facility's decayed infrastructure. The realization of being indefinitely marooned triggers deep psychological distress, specifically the articulated fear of prolonged separation from primary familial structures. Operational focus shifts entirely to auditory surveillance, attempting to isolate the specific mechanical acoustic signature of an approaching maritime combustion engine. The dense particulate matter of the marine layer drastically distorts acoustic vectors, making it impossible to determine the distance or direction of anomalous sounds. Operators debate the logistical viability of sustaining an extended multi-day deployment utilizing the severely depleted caloric reserves and failing thermal equipment. A sudden, distinct mechanical hum breaches the acoustic baseline, initially misidentified as high-altitude aviation before being reclassified as a surface-level anomaly. The acoustic signature indicates a completely different approach vector than the initial insertion route, suggesting the extraction asset is navigating via improvised radar headings. Visual confirmation remains impossible. Operators stare blindly into the opaque gray wall of the marine layer, relying entirely on escalating engine noise. The designated extraction timeline officially expires. The primary surface asset is classified as operationally delayed due to extreme navigational hazards. A faint, dark geometric anomaly suddenly materializes within the dense fog bank, breaking the absolute uniformity of the surrounding gray void. Visual analysis confirms the approaching silhouette matches the tactical profile of the designated extraction vessel, successfully navigating the hostile marine layer.
We got
the physical
5 minutes.
manifestation of the rescue asset immediately triggers an adrenaline-driven psychological reset, shifting the unit from passive survival to active extraction protocols. Securing the perimeter requires the rapid disassembly of the temporary bivouac and the consolidation of all remaining operational hardware into portable extraction configurations. Descent down the exterior primary access ladder must be executed with extreme caution. Localized precipitation has critically compromised the structural grip coefficient. The extraction vessel holds a precarious position against the volatile swells, requiring operators to execute a timed kinetic transfer from the ladder to the unstable deck. Successfully transferring the consolidated equipment payload to the extraction vessel demands maximum physical exertion and precise spatial coordination under high-stress conditions. Once all personnel and material assets are secured on the deck, the vessel immediately disengages from the hazardous proximity of the localized rock foundation. The operator of the extraction asset confirms the extreme difficulty of the localized navigation, citing the dense fog as a near-catastrophic operational barrier. Acceleration away from the target zone provides an immediate, albeit unstable, physical sanctuary from the absolute isolation of the maritime structure. Reviewing the captured optical and thermal data confirms the severe hostility of the environment and the absolute necessity of the extraction window. Within minutes of departure, the dense marine layer aggressively envelops the facility, completely erasing the massive stone structure from the visual spectrum. The operational footprint at the isolated coordinates is officially terminated, concluding a high-risk stress test of human endurance within a failed logistical node. Surviving a full 24-hour cycle at the location validates the extreme historical casualty rates and psychological trauma associated with legacy lighthouse maintenance. The physical isolation paradigm forces an absolute reliance on localized, self-contained survival loops, stripping away all illusions of modern interconnected safety nets. The total failure of redundant communication systems highlights the severe vulnerability of modern operatives when subjected to aggressive, unmitigated geographic suppression. Future deployments to similar operational theaters will mandate significantly upgraded thermal shielding and hardened, military-grade satellite uplink capabilities to ensure unit survival. The captured intelligence package provides a critical baseline for understanding the physical and psychological friction generated by absolute maritime isolation. Returning to the mainland logistical hub requires enduring a punishing 45-mile transit through the remaining chop of the dispersing storm cell. The physical toll of the operation manifests in severe caloric deficits, systemic thermal shock, and a documented degradation of short-term cognitive processing. The architectural resilience of the 1880s structure remains an anomalous data point, surviving a century of kinetic bombardment that rapidly destroys modern equipment. De-escalation of the survival posture reveals the latent psychological impact, requiring operators to undergo a mandatory recalibration period before assuming standard operational duties. The environmental hostility of the target zone serves as a continuous, unyielding barrier, actively rejecting human presence and punishing systemic failures with lethal efficiency. Complete extraction is confirmed as the vessel breaches the outer perimeter of the fog bank, re-establishing visual contact with the mainland horizon. The operation solidifies the classification of the coordinate as a hyper-lethal environment, totally unsuitable for sustained human occupation without massive infrastructural reinforcement. Final operational logs indicate that while the physical structure remains anchored, the human element was pushed to the absolute breaking point of operational cohesion. The structural asset returns to its primary function as an automated, unmanned sentinel, silently projecting a vital navigational warning into the hostile void. The raw visual intelligence gathered during the deployment provides irrefutable evidence of the severe localized conditions, validating the requirement for extreme pre-deployment conditioning. Post-mission analysis concludes. The isolated maritime installation successfully demonstrates the terrifying intersection of geographic isolation, failing infrastructure, and human vulnerability.